There we go. There we go, Mark. Over to you.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. I suppose virtually it's not quite the same as in person, but it's nice to be with you in your living rooms this evening. So thanks for tuning in. The work I'm going to be talking about this evening comes out of a couple of projects that I've been working on with the brilliant Professor Jane Whittle at the University of Exeter, who I've been collaborating with now for almost exactly 7 years since we started our first project together, which was on women's work in rural England from 1500 to 1700, and that ran from 2015 for 3 years, and then we got some more funding to do a follow-up project called Forms of Labour. So again, exploring similar themes of thinking about gender in the pre-industrial economy. And I just wanted to flag this up to say that the work I'm talking about tonight is a collaborative, comes from a collaborative project. It's not all my own work, and also that you can find out more about these projects if you're interested at these two project websites I've put the addresses up for. Okay, so my title for this talk, What Did Women Do All Day in Tudor and Stuart England, is obviously quite a broad one, and it probably needs a little bit of elaboration or a bit of focus. So I'm going to be talking about the period from roughly 1500 to 1700, and I'll come back to why this is an interesting in a moment. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on work in this period. Work was, of course, not the only way that women spent their time. For example, in my earlier work that I did before I started this project, I was researching alehouses and drinking culture in this same period. And one of the key findings from my book, which I'm shamelessly flashing up on the screen now, is that alehouses and pubs in the period were common sites of recreation for both men and women alike. So women did, of course, enjoy recreational and leisure time outside of work. Perhaps that could be a topic for a talk another time. But today I'm going to focus on working life, because essentially work was the main form of time use for the vast majority of women in this period. And I'm interested in focusing on the majority experience of women. So I'm not going to talk much about the gentry, who really represent only no more than 2% of the population in this period. And I'm not really going to say very much about the very poor or those who were unable to work either. I'm going to be focusing on what historians like to call the middling, lower sort of people, or what we might today call the middle class and working class. And my majority focus means that I'm also going to be talking primarily about rural areas. Only about 10% of the population actually lived in urban areas, in large towns and cities in this period. So the vast majority of the population lived in rural areas. So that's going to be my focus. And geographically, I'm going to be looking at the Southwest, as that's the focus of our projects. So a lot of my examples are going to be drawn from Devon and Somerset. Unfortunately, we didn't use Gloucestershire material because some of the records that we're looking at aren't as good for Gloucestershire for this period as the Devon and Somerset ones. So why then focus on the Tudor and Stuart period as a historian interested in women and interested in work? Well, it's a key period of economic development, because although these centuries are generally regarded as the pre-industrial centuries, those predating the dramatic changes associated with the Industrial Revolution that occur from around about 1750 onwards, historians have increasingly come to see the centuries before industrialization as an important part of the story of England's economic development, rather than just seeing the economy as suddenly bursting into life in 1750. There's been more and more interest in quite how that was able to happen, and looking at the kind of foundations for that takeoff. And indeed, there's much ongoing debate about why exactly it is that England became the world's first industrial nation. What was it that meant this process occurred in England before it did pretty much anywhere else. Some of the Low Countries and other parts of Northern Europe were not far behind, but England was sort of indisputably the first country to experience major industrialization. But as you might expect, there are lots of rival interpretations offered by historians about the causes of industrialization. There's certainly not a consensus on what caused it. But there has been a growing consensus that the foundations for this economic takeoff run deep, and that we should be thinking long term about what was happening in the 16th and 17th centuries. And one argument about this kind of long lead-in to industrialization, which was put forward by the historian Jan de Vries, is that the period I'm focusing on today witnessed what he called an industrious revolution. Put simply, what he meant by this was a process whereby the English, and in his argument, the Dutch as well, the English and Dutch workforces began to put in more hours of work and started to spend less time in the alehouse and participating in other leisure activities. And it was this growing work ethic that allowed the English economy to forge ahead of its competitors. And crucial to this argument is the role played by women's work in this process. Indeed, there have been a growing number of economic historians suggesting that it was the increasing contribution of women in particular to economic activity that underpinned the industrious revolution. These historians aren't necessarily arguing that women weren't working before these centuries, but that the nature of their work starts to change. They start to do more market-oriented work, so more work that produces an income for households. So in these arguments, it's not so much manpower as woman power that fires England's precocious economic development. So the subject of how much work and what type of work women were doing in Tudor and Stuart England is crucial to testing these arguments about the causes of industrialization and economic development, both in the past, but by implication, of course, in developing countries in the present as well. But how do we actually uncover what work women did on a day-to-day basis at a remove of several centuries? Well, there are a number of different sources of evidence that we can turn to. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages, like all historical sources. And there are 4 different types in particular that I want to draw on in this talk. So what I'm going to do is take each type in turn and think about what it might tell us about what women were doing all day in Tudor and Stuart England. So let's start with printed advice books. The 16th and 17th centuries saw an explosion of printed works in England after the introduction of Caxton's printing press towards the end of the 15th century. And from the later 1500s onwards, the subjects of printed books and pamphlets began to diversify beyond just religious works. So for the first sort of century of printing, most of the stuff that came off the printing press was religious works. But beyond that, once you start to get to the later 16th century, you get a much wider range of printed products. And one particularly popular genre in this period was that of conduct or advice literature. Handy guides on how to live a good life, as well as containing lots of practical advice. Of course, these were not affordable to everybody, and they would not have been readable by everybody. So in the year 1600, only about 30% of the adult male population and about 10% of the adult female population were fully literate and could read and write. So these types of books are not being read by everybody, but they would have been accessible to many members of the middle class, if not necessarily the working class. And helpfully for our purposes here, many of these works were dedicated to the ins and outs of married life, including comments on what kinds of work should fall to a husband and what types of work should be undertaken by a wife. So we can see a very popular text from the period here on the slide. You don't need to try and read it all. It's there if you want to, but I'll pick out the key bits that we want to talk about. So this text is Robert Cleaver's A Godly Form of Household Government, so a kind of ideal form of what should be happening in your household, published in 1598. And Cleaver tells us that the duty of the husband is to get goods and for the wife to gather them together, save them. The duty of the husband is to travel abroad to seek living. The wife's duty is to keep the house. The duty of the husband is to get money and provision, and of wives not vainly to spend it. The duty of the husband is to deal with many men, and the wife to talk with few. The husband to be intermeddling, the wife to be solitary and withdrawn. The duty of the man to be skillful in talk, and the wife to boast of silence. The duty of the husband to dispatch all things without doors, and of the wife to oversee and give order to all things within the house. So in many ways, Cleaver offers a classic statement of patriarchal values at the time, that a man's role was to represent the household in the outside world and to bring in an income, whereas the wife was expected to remain withdrawn at home, taking care of domestic duties and avoiding any sort of public role. The public world was a man's world. Women were supposed to stay at home. A point was also captured in Richard Brathwaite's bestseller, The Good Wife, or A Rare One Amongst Women, from 1618, where he said that a wife should be like a snail, that is to say, always in her house. But if some of these books concern themselves principally with restating patriarchal dictates of where women should work, and remember, of course, that almost all books at this time were authored by men, other conduct books are a bit more practical in their approach. And these tell us a bit more about the tasks that women might actually have been doing on a day-to-day basis. So useful here is John Fitzherbert's The Book of Husbandry from 1533, where he had a section on the works that a wife should do in general, listing a wife's duties. So this is what he suggested a wife needed to do. When thou art up and ready, thy first sweep thy house, dress up thy dishboard, and set all things in good order within thy house. Milk thy cows, suckle thy calves, fry up thy milk, take up thy children and array them, and provide for thy husband's breakfast, dinner, supper, and for the children and servants, and take thy part with them. And to ordain corn and malt to the mill, to bake and brew with all what is needed. Thou must make butter and cheese when thou may, serve the swine both morning and evening, give the chickens meat in the morning, take heed how the hens, ducks, and geese do lay, gather up their eggs. And in the beginning of March is a time for a wife to make her garden, to get as many good herbs and seeds as she can, especially such as be good for the pot, and to eat as oft as need shall require it, must be weeded, for all the weeds will overgrow the herbs. It's a long list, but that's not all. He goes on. And also in March is time to sow flax and hemp, how it should be sown, weeded, pulled, watered, washed, dried, beaten, spun, wounded, wrapped, and woven. It needeth not me for me to show, for they be wife enough. In a sense, he's saying women will know how to do all these things. I don't need to tell you that. Then women will need to make sheets, boardcloths, towels, shirts, smocks, and other necessaries. Therefore, let thy distaff always be ready for a pastime, that thou not be idle. And undoubted a woman cannot get her living honestly without spinning on the distaff. He also says that it's a wife's occupation to winnow all manner of corn, to make malt, to wash and wring, to make hay, to shear corn, to help her husband fill the muck wain or the dung cart, to drive the plough, to load hay, corn, and such others, to go to market, to sell butter and cheese and milk and eggs, and also to buy all manner of necessary things belonging to the household, and to make a true reckoning and account to her husband what she hath received and what she hath paid. And if the husband goes to market, then he shall do likewise tell his wife what he spent. So it's a fairly exhaustive list of tasks. And interestingly, not all of these fit into the model of men's work as public and women's work as private. A wife, for example, was expected to go to market, to do a household's buying and selling, as well at times as working in the fields and on the farm. And even tasks that would have taken place within the home were not just what we think of as traditional domestic tasks, such as cooking and cleaning and childcare. As we can see in the list, there was all manner of brewing, cheese making, animal husbandry, spinning, clothes making, even acting as an accountant for the household, tasks that would have all required no small degree of skill and competence. The significance then of a woman's work to the family economy was not lost on all male authors of advice literature. Indeed, as Thomas Tusser put it in his best-selling 500 Points for Good Husbandry United to as Many Good Housewifery in 1573, though husbandry seemeth to bring in the gains, yet housewifery labours seem equal in pains. Some respite to husbands the weather may send, but housewives' affairs have an end. So from these printed works, we can get some idea of the range of work activities that women were expected to do within the household and indeed without of the household. But these printed books are nonetheless telling us about ideals, about what a husband should do and what a wife should do. They don't necessarily tell us about what was actually happening in practice. So for that, we need to turn our attention to other forms of evidence. So the next type of evidence I want to consider is wage information. Indeed, economic historians like myself often turn to wage information to explore working life in the past. And it's a type of evidence that we can make use of here. So for example, county magistrates were often responsible for setting guidelines as to what level of wages should be paid for certain types of work. And we can see some of these examples of wage setting from the Devon magistrates in 1654, who stipulated the following rates: that husbandry labourers, male husbandry labourers, in the winter should be paid 3d a day, for the rest of the year 4d. If they were mowing corn or grass, they should be paid 6d, and they should also be given food and drink worth 6d each day. Women that were working in the field, if they were labouring at hay, they should be paid 2d. In the corn harvest, 4d, and for other work, 2d, plus food and drink worth 4d per day. And it also set rates for women's spinning, for spinning of yarn, that women's spinning should be given 6d per week without food and drink, or with food and drink rather, and 16d a week without it. So this kind of information shows us, for one thing, that men generally earn higher wages than women for doing similar types of work, here labouring in the fields. But these wage rates also show us that women not only worked within their households or on their own farms, doing all the activities that we saw Fitzherbert list, but there were also opportunities for them to earn wages outside of their own family economy, either by spinning, or especially at certain times of year, such as the hay harvest and the corn harvest, by working for wages in the fields of large-scale capitalist farmers. And we can see further evidence of this in the household accounts of John Willoughby of Leyhill, which is near Payhembry in East Devon from the 1640s. He's got a list here of the workers that he hired to work the harvest in August of 1644. And of the 15 workers listed here that he hired that year, Willoughby hired 10 men and 5 women, including the husband-wife team of Mr. and Mrs. Peter Orton, and the team of Widow Bernard and her son. And interestingly, John Willoughby paid men and women alike at 4d per day for their efforts. So there was no gender pay gap on his farm, even if there was pretty much everywhere else. And there were some phases of the agricultural cycle that offered even more opportunities for women to earn wages. So out of the 16 individuals that he hired to weed the fields in May of 1645, there were 10 women and just 6 men. So weeding was dominated by women on this farm. Most of the women received 6p a day. Some of the men received 8p, but others only 4p. So this might denote different skill levels required for the different tasks they did.
We pause this and not.
Or perhaps there was an age hierarchy at work.
Don't, because it's recording Vera.
I can actually.
So this kind of wage information tells us something that printed advice literature does not. That women not only undertook a vast range of domestic duties, many also participated in forms of waged work, such as spinning yarn or seasonal field work. But of course, this wage information also has limitations as a form of evidence, because the vast majority of work undertaken by women was not, of course, done for wages. So if we want to find out a bit more about forms of unwaged work, we can turn to a third type of evidence here. So now I want to say a little bit about inventories. So inventories were lists of goods of a deceased individual that were produced as part of the testamentary process. And we can also use these lists of goods to find out something about the work that a deceased individual had been engaged in. If we look carefully at the kinds of tools, supplies, and even the debts an individual had, we can extrapolate something about what they did to make a living. Of course, this comes with an important caveat for looking at women's work. Married women's goods automatically became the property of their husband upon marriage. So upon their death, they technically had no goods of their own to be inventoried. So when we do have inventories for women, they're only ever for either widows or for single unmarried women. But these are nonetheless interesting for us. Let's take then the inventory of Joan Brownscombe of Dawlish in Devon, who died in August of 1590. It's not actually clear from the inventory whether she was a widow or a single woman when she died, but she was certainly not married, of course. She had a total inventoried wealth of £15, 15 shillings and 4p. Not bad, but not especially wealthy. She was kind of solid, lower middle class, essentially. You can see listed here that she had a range of clothes, furniture and furnishings and kitchenware in her house. But she also had a number of items that are a bit more interesting in terms of thinking about what she did for a living. So she owned hemp to the value of 13 shillings and 4p, along with a ranger, which is a type of sieve, a hemp comb, and a polchin iron or a parching iron worth 2 shillings. All of these were tools that were used for making hemp cloth. She also owned 3 swine hogs that were worth 11 shillings, and she owned 3 pilchard nets worth 30 shillings, 2 slings of net, 1 new thread, and a piece of tackle, which are worth 16 shillings. So it seems from this evidence as though Joan Brownscombe helped to support herself by producing hemp cloth, by keeping some pigs, and possibly also by fishing. That said, and this is one of the problems with inventories as a type of evidence, we don't know that Joan was necessarily involved in all of these tasks herself. Just because she owned the tools or the animals doesn't necessarily mean she used them directly. For example, there's very little evidence that women in the coastal communities of Devon were involved directly in fishing themselves. In all the evidence we've looked at, we have not found any examples of women actually fishing. There is, however, evidence that women often owned boats or had shares in fishing enterprises. And many married women also took responsibility for selling the fish and managing the businesses of their fishermen husbands, whilst the latter spent much of their time at sea. Not to mention, of course, running households in the absence of their husbands. It's possible then that Joan's pilchard nets were in fact her share in a fishing venture of some sort. That women could then be involved in the world of business and enterprise can be seen in another inventory, this time of Thomasine Edmonds of Little Hempston in Devon, a spinster who died in 1694. Thomasine was actually a very popular and Devonian name in this period. And we can see from her inventory that Thomasine, like many single women, acted as a moneylender. So in addition to a relatively modest quantity of clothing, jewellery and kitchenware, the inventory details a number of debts that were owed to her. She was due from Mr. Richard Edmonds of Cornworthy by a bond dated the 2nd of October 1689, £30, with interest due in January 1694 of £2 and 5 shillings. She was due on bond from Edward Beard of Little Hempston, £10, with interest due of 9 shillings. She was due another debt from Edmund Beard aforesaid that was worth £2 and 10 shillings. She was due from John Edmonds of Hallwell, £10, with interest due of £3 15 shillings. She had a debt due from Mrs. Anne Bogan of Uphempston, a widow, worth £11. She had a debt due from one Mr. John of Totnes, from one Saunders of Totnes. Another debt due on a bond with interest from Thomas Tudd of Bury Pomeroy, which is looked on as a desperate debt. In other words, he was a poor man. There was no expectation he'd ever pay it back. In total, her debts owed to Thomasine Edmonds plus interest, she was worth over £100, which is a substantial sum for this time period. So these inventories can reveal to us yet another aspect of women's work that we don't find featuring prominently in the idealized Vicebook accounts of what women did, or indeed in wage information. And that's their involvement in various forms of business enterprise. As wives, this might involve playing a key role running a business jointly with their husband, but for widows and single women, it could mean acting as a significant shareholder in a business or acting as a moneylender. Again, though, we have to bear in mind the limitations of our sources here. Inventories tend to overrepresent the experience of relatively wealthy individuals. For most of the working classes in this period and for the poor, their stock of goods were not considered valuable enough to make an inventory worthwhile. So most of the examples of inventories that survive, like the ones I've discussed here, pertain to comfortable middling sorts or above. And it's also the case, as I've said, that they don't tell us whether the women who owned tools or animals actually took part in the work tasks we would associate with those tools and animals. But for that, we can turn to our fourth type of evidence that I want to talk about in a bit more detail, and that is witness statements. So, central to the research projects that myself and Jane Whittle have been engaged in are these witness statements, because what we wanted to do is explore a different type of evidence, one that would allow us to get closer to the day-to-day realities of working life for the majority of women. So we chose to focus on these witness statements that were taken from across a range of different court cases in our period. And they survive in the tens of thousands, possibly even the hundreds of thousands for the 16th and 17th centuries. 16th and 17th century England was an incredibly bureaucratic place, and court officials wrote a lot of things down, and they tended to keep the vast majority of court papers that were produced. And thankfully for us historians, not all, but a great many of these have survived down the centuries and now reside in our local record offices, as I'm sure many of you are well aware. So witnesses in the types of cases we were looking at were asked what they were doing in the build-up to or at the time of a crime that they either witnessed or they were in some way involved in. And the responses that they gave about what they were doing provide us with thousands of vignettes of people going about their everyday work activities. So this is a type of evidence that is not about ideals or wages or the ownership of work tools. It's a type of evidence that allows us to actually catch people in the act of working, so to speak, people literally telling us directly what they were doing on at a particular moment in time. So what we've been doing is gathering as many of these statements as we possibly can for analysis. And over the past 7 years, we've collected almost 10,000 work activities from reading about 40,000 of these witness statements. So what I want to do for the remainder of my time is give you some examples from these statements that highlight once more the vast range of work activities that women could be involved in. Unsurprisingly, domestic work of various sorts turns up in these statements. So Ede Simcott, who was a maidservant from Colebrook in Devon in April 1598, told a local magistrate that she had been sweeping a low room and house wherein a chest did stand, when she found items of silver that were thought to have been stolen hidden in this chest. And the chest itself was found amongst the filth and dust which came and rose of the sweeping of the said house, she tells us, which kind of implies that actually sweeping the floor didn't happen that often if the house was as filthy and dusty as she's suggesting here. But we've got an example of cleaning captured here. But even routine forms of housework did not necessarily confine women within the home, as we've already suggested. So Jane Jordan, who was the wife of William Jordan, described as an iron man of Luckham, Devon, meaning that he made iron rather than, I think, meaning he was a triathlete or a superhero. So in November of 1593, Jane Jordan was washing her muslin clothes at a certain iron mill pond of water, as she used to do often. So doing the washing would often take people out to ponds and rivers and bodies of water near their homes. How do we know about this? Why did this end up in the court record? Well, this is actually from a coroner's report of an accidental death. So she ended up drowning tragically in this mill pond. The next example we've got is from Jane Knight, a spinster, a single woman and servant maid of Dipford in Devon, who in June 1690 had also been doing some washing. She'd washed several linen clothes on Wednesday last, and that night she laid them on her master's, that's the his here, on her master's herb garden hedge for their whitening. So you'd leave them out on the hedge overnight on the full moon, which is thought to whiten the clothes. We have lots of examples of people hanging clothes out on hedges, because what happens is passers-by think, that looks like a nice shirt, and they pinch them off the hedge and make off with them. And then we end up getting a court case of where these stolen goods are looked for. So we've got, that's where that type of example comes from. What's perhaps more surprising about this material is that we've actually got very few examples of women engaged in cooking, or indeed of men engaged in cooking for that matter. Got one tangential one here, a Jane Stanter of Landford in Wiltshire, who in March 1555 was climbing a ladder to pluck down some onions from a store when she fell from the ladder to her death. So this was another coroner's report. So why is there no, why aren't we finding very much cooking? Well, what we do often find in these records are pots simply left boiling away on their own, unattended. For instance, when the constables of Oakhampton went to search the house of Walter Kiss in December of 1689, looking for a stolen sheep, they found one breast of mutton, which was then boiling in his crock. And we actually have quite a lot of examples such as this. It was quite common in the Devon and Somerset records. There are massive numbers of cases relating to sheep theft. And what often happens is when people steal a sheep, you skin it and butcher it as quickly as you can and stick it in the pot so that if someone comes looking for it, they can't identify it as their own sheep. But in almost all the cases we have of this happening, no one's actually tending the pot. Once it's been put in the pot, it's just left to boil on its own. And this suggests, we think, that many women probably spent rather less time slaving over a hot crock than we might expect. If the standard method of cooking was to leave things bubbling away whilst you got on with other things, that might help to explain how women found the time to do so many other work activities. We can find other examples that support some of the other types of work that we've been seeing so far. Especially activities of women engaging in work activities outside of the home itself. And agriculture features prominently in these records. So for instance, at Instow in 1634, between Whitsuntide and Midsummer, Margaret Pugsley, Agnes Hailwood and Joan Wilkie were weeding of corn in a field when Joan Wilkie said something defamatory about her stepmother. So we know about this case because it ended up as a defamation case in the local church courts. If someone insulted you and defamed you in public, you could take them to the local church courts to try and clear your name. So we get lots of examples of what people were doing when somebody said something defamatory. So we've got 3 women weeding corn here. Agnes Clement of Midsummer Norton in Somerset in July 1608 was sent for by her master to come and winnow corn whilst the wind did blow, only for her master to sexually assault her when she arrived to undertake the task. And that's another source type of case that a lot of our material comes from. But women were not only involved in agriculture on a seasonal basis, helping with weeding and harvesting, which, as we've seen, they often did do for wages. They're involved in a whole range of farming tasks throughout the year, some waged, but many unwaged. In June of 1620, for instance, Grace Welsh of St. David's in Exeter helped her husband to drive 3 heifers from Woodbury to Crediton Market. They were accused of having stolen these heifers. That's where that case came from. And Alice Kingston of St. Edmonds in Exeter in 1634 told a church court that she had been milking cows in a particular field in Exeter. This was part of a tithe dispute. And the church was trying to figure out how much tithe milk her master owed to the church, and she attested to how many cows she knew because she'd been responsible for milking them. Perhaps more surprisingly, women were often involved in types of work that we might expect to have been the preserve of skilled male workers. So Anne Joss and Wilmota Smallridge of Dunsford in the 1630s together undertook the yearly task of shearing 50 sheep for one Mr. Westcott. And one Knott's wife of Witheridge in May 1598 confessed that she had newly shorn 7 sheep of one Hugh Uppington's. So the slaughter and skinning of animals, a task sometimes entrusted to specialist butchers, was also something on many occasions undertaken by women at home. So Philip Marshall, who was a widow, Philip Marshall is actually a woman. Philip was another popular women's name in 17th century Devon. So Philip Marshall and her daughter Elizabeth Marshall of Bratton in Devon in December 1597 confessed that a lamb that was found upon their search in their house was taken by her and her daughter and killed and dressed in this examinant's house to serve their great need. So they admitted they'd stolen this sheep, but they'd also killed it, skinned it and dressed it, so prepared it for the pot themselves. They hadn't needed a specialist male butcher. In 1598, in Lidford, one Thomasine Northcott provided a nice added detail in her testimony from a case about a sheep that had been stolen, a sheepskin that had been stolen from her, telling us that in the process of skinning the sheep herself, she did cut the ears from the skin of the sheep and did feed them to her cat. So if women were actually involved in some of the more skilled aspects of animal husbandry, they could also be involved in some of the more physical aspects of agricultural work as well. So in June of 1556, at Ilsington on Dartmoor, the servant Wilmota Rogers was pitching hay up to her master in his hayloft, a job we might expect to be the remit of a male rather than a female servant, given the physicality involved. But this is not a unique example. In 1607, another servant, Elizabeth Brown of Misterton in Somerset, was ordered by her master's son to throw wheat sheaves to him in his hayloft. Agnes Parker of Chilton Canterlow in Somerset was crossing a bridge in 1592 with a measure of hay on her head and a pot for milking in her hand, carrying a heavy load of goods, when she was tragically blown off the bridge by a gust of wind and drowned in a nearby ditch. So that was another coroner's report. And in fact, on those project websites I mentioned, Jane Whittle has written a blog post about women carrying things on their head, which is quite a common type of work activity and a means of transport. It's interesting examples we have of people moving goods around. When we have examples of women moving goods, they're very often carrying them, often on their heads. When men are moving goods around, they're usually moving them on carts and driving carts around. So actually, in practice, men are kind of doing the lazier form of moving goods. They're using carts and horses to help them, whereas women tend to actually have to carry goods themselves. We don't very often find women driving carts. It seems clear enough from these cases then that women were involved in at least some of the agricultural tasks that required a good deal of strength, such as the carrying and throwing involved in moving and storing of hay. And our statements can also shed further light on women's involvement in the world of commerce. So whilst money lending and business investments might have been the preserve of wealthier women, more humble women were involved in the world of day-to-day buying and selling. So defending herself against an accusation of stealing a purse in 1597, Joanne Lugg testified that she had come into the house of Maud Lee of Sidbury aforesaid to buy a cheese. But in the absence of the said Maud, she did lay down a cloth upon the board, and when she had bought the cheese and paid 3d for the same, she intended to depart, did take up her cloth, and by chance did take the purse of the said Maud being under the said cloth, and carried it away with her. Sounds like a bit of a flimsy cover story to me, but it nonetheless reveals Joanne's involvement in everyday forms of commerce. Another example of women involved in commerce comes from another fishing community. Wilmota Horne, wife of William Horne, who was a weaver from Bigbury in Devon. In 1598, she told the court that she had witnessed something in the market because she'd been selling pilchards at Modbury Market. In 2 market days, this lent 100 of pilchards each day. It's a fairly large scale operation. And Alice Day of Showbrook was accused of stealing a sheep in December of 1597. But she insisted she had bought a piece of mutton that was found in her house in Exeter in the Butcher's Row. And it was not only when engaged in everyday commerce that women might venture out of the home to do these forms of public-facing work activities. Earth Bickley of Crediton, the wife of a weaver of Dozens and Kerseys, was sent by him to his employer's house to fetch yarn in June of 1597, so helping her husband with his work activity. But this was another case, sadly, where she was then sexually assaulted by the employer that she'd gone to collect the yarn from. And of course, if there was ever a spare moment in between all of these different work activities, women could be found, like the wife of Robert Hoskins of Earlstoke in Wiltshire, who had spun up wool into yarn in 1622, taking up the distaff and spinning so that they may never be idle for a moment. So just a final sort of slide of evidence before some conclusions. Just wanted to flash up, these are some of the results that we found from tallying up all of these different work activities. So they're all interesting examples in their own right, but we've also tried to quantify them to get a clearer sense of just exactly how much work women were doing in different parts of the economy. So this table, if you're interested in this kind of thing, gives you a good sense of our sort of overall results. And what we've done is we've by counting up examples of men doing work activities and of women doing work activities, we've calculated the percentage of work tasks in different areas of the economy that were done by women. So you can see that in agricultural work, over a third of agricultural work was done by women in our sample. Care work, and a little bit further down the list, housework, were overwhelmingly done by women, between 80 and 90%. So women were doing the vast majority of what we think of as traditional women's work of childcare and housework and cooking and cleaning and so on. But as you can see from the rest of the table, they weren't only doing those domestic duties, they were also doing a lot of work in other areas of the economy as well. So women were doing 50% of the commercial work that we found. They were doing 43% of the craft and construction work. A lot of that was accounted for by all of that spinning. 43% of food processing activities as well. Over half of management, a lot of that was instructing servants or dealing with financial payments and so on. Mining and quarrying, almost a quarter of our mining and quarrying activities were done by women. Not usually, it should be said in this case, actually mining directly or digging, but working at mines, moving coal or other mine goods around or washing them and so on. So they were involved in those industries. Transport as well. You can see across almost all sectors of the economy from this table, women were doing a significant percentage of the work activities that we found in all of these witness statements. Okay, so let's try and sum all of this up. Women in the period 1500 to 1700 undoubtedly did spend much of their time doing the kinds of work inside the home that advice book writers like Robert Cleaver suggested was their appropriate role: cleaning, washing, cooking, and of course, childcare. Now, you'll notice I haven't actually said very much about childcare in the examples that I've talked about. And that's because it's actually very rarely recorded in any of the types of evidence that I've talked about this evening, but it turns up occasionally in some of these witness statements. But usually when women are asked what they were doing at the time that something happened, they don't usually say, I was looking after a child. They usually say they're doing something else, but sometimes they reference the fact that they also had a small child with them. So childcare, again, I think why it doesn't come up more in these cases is because it was usually done simultaneously with doing something else, that you looked after the children whilst you were also doing 101 other things, rather than it being a dedicated work activity where you looked after the children and weren't engaged in something else at the same time. And often we have evidence of kind of older children, or servants might be keeping an eye on children in a similar way. But childcare is an interesting category of evidence here. So women spent a lot of time, and they did the vast majority of these what we might think of as traditional forms of women's work. And whilst many gentry women, even maybe some upper middle class women, might have employed some servants to help with these tasks, that doesn't necessarily mean that even those wealthier women would have been off putting their feet up. Because we've seen that there was a really wide range of work activities that women busied themselves with. They were involved in farming, not just seasonal agricultural labour. They were involved in everyday commerce, from buying and selling goods at the market through to larger scale business management, investments and money lending. Women even served as a key component of England's largest industry in the age before the Industrial Revolution. Spinning yarn in any small windows of spare time that they had to supply the textile industry. Underpinning that crucial industry, that was the big industry before the Industrial Revolution, whilst earning some extra income to support their families. So despite the patriarchal view that stipulated that a woman's role was relatively confined and was supposed to women's work was supposed to take place in the home, and indeed despite the dangers, as we have seen, that were present for women who ventured outside of the house to work. A number of these cases came from, a number of these examples we've looked at came from cases where women were sexually assaulted whilst going about their work. There were nonetheless many ways that women in this period contributed to the wider economy beyond domestic work. So any story about the precocious and remarkable economic growth of England from the 18th century onwards cannot ignore the fact that hardworking women were at the very heart of the English economy in the preceding centuries. And I will leave it there, I think, and open up to questions. Thank you for listening.